Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Tuesday. My name is Hannah. I lead email and community at Grow Class. If we haven't met before, hello, it's nice to meet you. Today, I'm really excited to kick off how to ask fewer questions for customer engagement with Jeff Wetherhold. Jeff is a trainer and a coach with over 15 years of experience supporting hundreds of teams in making and sustaining changes to improve client outcomes. So teaching teams to plan for change is the easier part of his job. The harder part is teaching them how to help others to move towards accepting change that they don't want to accept. So that's where motivational interviewing comes in. That's what we're about to learn today. So really excited for that. I'm going to drop all of Jeff's links in the chat. So if you want to connect with him, you can find him there. We do have time for a Q&A, so feel free to drop your questions throughout. You can drop them in the chat. You can use the hand up emoji. Feel free to unmute yourself as well. There's no such thing as a dumb question, so just remember this is a non-judgmental zone. Just ask that you keep it kind and respectful, and everyone will be all good. Well, with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff so we can learn how to ask fewer questions for customer engagement. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm really looking forward to this opportunity, in part because I don't know how this is going to go over with this group. And that's really exciting to me. So I hope this is helpful to a lot of you. I joined Growcast about 2 years ago. I am not a marketing professional, a fact that will become apparent very quickly to all of you, because I needed a place as a solopreneur, I guess, to think about marketing that didn't make me feel icky. And a lot of the things that made me not feel good about marketing are stereotypically aggressive and masculine. So people look at me and think you ought to be fine with that. I'm not fine. So I'm very grateful to have this community and be here with all of you, particularly to share this today. So my background is in change management. And my professional goal is that I want to revolutionize change management for collective well-being. I help teams move toward change, and I do that with the knowledge that a lot of the work that we call change management isn't effective and isn't person-centered. There's a report put out earlier this year from one of the big four consultancies that we've probably all heard of, which said that 88% of transformation efforts in businesses don't produce any long-term impact. 88% is an awful lot. That's pretty consistent with my experience. And I think a big part of that is we acknowledge the part of change that's easier for us to think about and manage. We think about processes and frameworks. We think about arguments for stakeholder engagement. We think about audience segmentation and engagement, but we don't think about the human side of it. How do we talk to one another? How do we accept when we don't get back what we might have planned to get, what we might have hoped to get back? How do we work with that? So a lot of my background is in continuous improvement, which is sometimes called quality improvement or process improvement. That's really where I focus on those parts of change we can control and script and plan out. And where I'm going to focus today is on motivational interviewing, which is where I turn for help with the part of change that we can't control, where we need other people to make changes that we can't make them make. And that goes for a lot of our lives, I think. I also work with teams on strategic planning because for me, this is a really nice venue to put those two together to help teams think about how we get where we want to be in 2 or 3 or 5 years. So my goals for the session today are to describe motivational interviewing and its applications. We're not going to go deep on this. When I train teams in motivational interviewing, it's usually about 16 hours. We don't have that kind of time. So we're going to focus on a couple of the skills that are core to motivational interviewing and offer some context for what it is. We're not going to talk about all the skills. We're not going to talk about how to structure good motivational interviewing conversations. We're not going to practice, and practice is essential to doing this well. If you'd ever like to learn more about what that process is like, I am here and happy to talk. But we're going to do a quick intro to MI. We're going to talk about the risks of overusing questions, because I think one of the things I thought coming in to my learning experience with MI was questions are good. And what I've come out of this realizing is that questions are good when they're used thoughtfully and sparingly. And when we over-rely on them, we often do harm when we didn't have intention to do harm. So then what? If I'm taking your questions away, what am I going to give you back? What are you supposed to say? We're going to talk about how to strengthen your use of reflective language to encourage change and why that's meaningful. Now, is anybody here familiar with MI? Maybe speak up or raise a hand or put it in the chat. Has anyone ever heard the term motivational interviewing? I know individually those nouns make sense. Seen a lot of shaking heads, no. Not before this. All right. Lots of no's. Okay. So we'll keep moving forward with this. The quick version, and I'll go into a little more depth on what this is. Motivational interviewing is a set of conversational tools and skills for helping people move toward change that you can't create for them. But implicit in that is it has to be change that they want to make on some level, change that they accept. And what got me here, only in talking with me, thank you so much. What got me here was twofold. One was in the change management work that I do, I started to get more and more questions about what happened when the process broke down. And the simplest questions were the ones that I felt least capable of answering. I'd hear things like, what do I say to them? I thought they were going to do this and they're not. I don't want to fire them. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to answer that? And I didn't feel like I could give people the kind of answers they deserved. I didn't feel capable. So I went looking for skill sets that in my experience as a trainer, I could train to that would be helpful. And motivational interviewing is the best thing that I've found. What also got me here is that I had an experience around the same time of being support for a member of my extended family with serious addiction issues and working through the recovery industry, for lack of a better term, with them. Now, motivational interviewing has the deepest roots in addiction and recovery for reasons that will probably be pretty clear once you've learned a bit about it. This is the place in which MI is supposed to be practiced with the most frequency and fidelity, right? We're supposed to do it well there. My experience of navigating the recovery industry was quite the opposite. And for someone who's worked in healthcare for 15 years at this point, where we talk about things one way and do different things more frequently than I'd like to admit, I felt like I would be prepared for the size of the gap between what we say we do and what we actually do. I was in no way, shape, or form prepared. The gap is immense. And part of the way that I processed that and dealt with it was I thought, well, I could learn how to do this well. So here we are. So the textbook definition, and this is the 4th edition of Motivational Interviewing, Helping People Change and Grow, written by the 2 founders of the discipline. This was just issued last year. Motivational interviewing is a particular way of talking with people about change and growth to strengthen their own motivation and commitment. Does anything strike you about that definition? Anything you like, dislike? Anything look weird? Is that an unfair question to ask a group of people who are totally new to this? It places a lot of responsibility on the purpose at the receiving end of change, right? We're focusing on the outcome. I like that. Sounds coachy. It does sound coachy. I think the first word I used when I read this was folksy. It sounds folksy to me. Sounds like a coaching call. Guilty. I like the connection of change with growth. You don't usually see that. That's a really good point. We don't always see those two linked. And I like that connection here too. So it's a pretty folksy definition. It's a pretty broad definition. One of the nice things about motivational interviewing is that there is room to adapt this to a lot of different settings and a lot of different disciplines, which is why I'm talking with all of you. You are not the core audience that this was developed for. But I think that this is something that can be helpful to you. I don't know 100% how it can be helpful. You all can take it and learn that and maybe tell me. So MI helps us start by reframing our own thinking about the challenges that individuals face when they consider change. It helps us take a step back before we intervene. It provides us with a very concrete set of skills and techniques to help others create change, down to what do I say? And when we evaluate these conversations, and there are 2 approved tools for evaluating conversations for consistency with motivational interviewing, we get down to the level of individual utterances. Now, it takes a while to get there, but that is on the table. That is something we can do with this tool set. It's also supported by a very deep evidence base. So at this point, this has been around for more than 30 years. We've got 2,500 plus randomized clinical trials, more entries on Google Scholar than I care to count, and a lot of very different settings in which this has been proven to be helpful, right? Is this the answer to all of life's problems? No, absolutely not. Is this something that is broad enough to be differently helpful across a wide variety of disciplines, and in my opinion, including your own? Yeah, I believe it is. And there's a lot of evidence out there for everything from substance use to eating disorders to de-radicalization to behavioral health to, I have no idea who applied this in dentistry, but I salute them. There's a lot of evidence out there at this point, and it helps to be able to teach to that evidence. Now, this is the point at which some folks, myself included, might be tempted to think, this is the best thing since sliced bread. I should be using this all the time. Not quite. So I'm going to put up the caution sign on that early on in the session and say that there are a lot of ways to use this appropriately. There are ways to use this inappropriately. So what do we look for if we want to help people use MI appropriately? Well, we want there to be a specific problem or behavior to address. And this is twofold. One is for the benefit of the recipient. One is for the benefit of the interviewer, because for as flexible as it is, MI conversations can go in circles very easily if there's not a specific problem or behavior to focus on. So that is not to say that the person on the other end of that conversation believes they need to change. It's only to say that they understand why you're there. What is the specific problem or behavior that you want to talk about? The recipient needs to have agency. And for me, that means the freedom to make their own decisions without consequences from you or your organization. So with clients or patients, this is easier. Unless someone in healthcare, unless someone is court ordered to receive care, they don't have to do anything. I work with clinicians all the time. The patients that come into their office have to do very little of what they say. They may feel compelled to, but they don't have to do it. So with patients or clients, this is easier. Where this gets complicated, and for me a little more interesting, is when we apply it to within teams and to management and working with peers. Because I think I know MI has very powerful applications in those settings, and yet we need to be very careful because we don't all have agency over every part of our jobs. There are things we have to do to keep our jobs or to be promoted. There are things our bosses have to do to have the same. Doesn't make them good or bad, but if we're constrained, it's an inappropriate use of these techniques, right? We can't have an MI conversation, hear somebody tell us they don't want to change, and then decide not to promote them or decide that they can't work there anymore. That's not an ethical use of the tool. And we want to make sure it's ethical to influence their decision. It's not okay to try and move somebody toward a change that we know is going to be harmful to them. So those are the 3 things we look for: specificity, agency, and ethics. There's a lot within bounds, but I think it's important to acknowledge what's out of bounds when it comes to that. Any questions or reactions to that so far? we're going to do a lot of back and forth in the second half of this call. So I'm going to do my best to talk in the first half so that I am not talking through the second half, because we've got some exercises and some chances to apply this. When we think about MI, we start from a mindset. And the 4 characteristics of that mindset are partnership, acceptance, compassion, and empowerment. These are the characteristics that we want to model. And in a full training, we would focus on these with some time. In the absence of time, what I would encourage you all to do is just take a few seconds, because I think you have positive associations with at least some, if not all, of these words. And I think that there are people in your life who have shown these qualities to you. So I'd like you to take just a couple seconds and think about someone who showed you partnership or acceptance or compassion, or who empowered you, maybe when you didn't expect it, when they didn't have to do that. If we had a good hour, we'd share stories, but we don't. So what I'd ask you to do is to hold that person in your mind for the remainder of the session today, and to maybe use that positive impact that they've had as a way to center yourself on how to approach this well. The first thing we talk about after that, I guess that would make it the second thing now, wouldn't it, is listening. One of the things that we get better at over time when we practice MI is speaking less and hearing more. And that's a hard thing to do at first, because in my experience, changes to the way we listen change the way we speak. And changes to the way we speak change the way we listen. But you got to start somewhere. And it's never harder than when you're first starting. So as I learned and got better at this discipline, one of the things I found, it was much easier to listen when I started to talk differently. So has anyone ever had the experience of knowing you should be listening, but actually thinking about what you're going to say next? All the time. This is something people do. I don't think it's something we can just extinguish. I used to think if I could just stop doing that, I'd be a better listener. I no longer think that's possible. I think the best we can do is change the way we talk so that when we're thinking about what to say next, it's about them and not us. And that's one of the things that MI can help us do. From there, we talk about this concept of ambivalence. So I threw an internet definition up here really quickly, so we had that to center on: the state of having 2 opposing feelings at the same time. Motivational interviewing starts from the premise that we are all ambivalent about change. I could win the lottery tomorrow, and I would be ambivalent about change. Not ambivalent enough not to take the money. Let's not be ridiculous. What are my friends going to think of me? How's my life going to change? I'm going on vacation on Thursday, which is awesome. I am ambivalent. Am I really getting everything done between now and then? Am I going to be able to turn off for that time? We often think of ambivalence as something that we want to do away with or extinguish. I don't think that's realistic either. I think our goal in an MI consistent conversation is to think about rebalancing ambivalence, because people make decisions to accept change all the time and stay ambivalent. They're still conflicted. I do a lot of coaching with organizations around having conversations on vaccination. Plenty of people who decide to accept vaccination still have reservations. But when we move the goal from convincing someone to not be ambivalent to rebalancing, we open up a lot of opportunities. At that point, it doesn't have to be, I need to make you think differently about vaccines. It can be, can I take those reasons you're hesitant and lower the volume a little? Or can I take those reasons you're considering this and raise the volume? At that point, conversations become a lot more humane for both the recipient and the interviewer, who often felt like they had to convince people of something they were never going to be able to convince them of in the space of a conversation. Ambivalence in the context of MI is something that we think of as a balance of change and sustained talk. So these are terms that we use pretty regularly. Change talk is any language in the direction of change that an individual expresses in their own words. And sustained talk is any language in the direction of the status quo. And often we hear these together. Of course, I'd love to exercise more, but have you seen my schedule? There's no way I can make that work. So what we learn to do is listen for the little bits and pieces of change talk that we can amplify and for the sustained talk that we want to address. Now, it would be easy to think here, and I have been guilty of thinking, we'll just ignore the sustained talk. That's not really the answer either. What we want to do is develop a capability over time to strike a balance where we acknowledge that sustained talk, but we don't feed it. Because if someone doesn't feel heard, they're not very likely to accept what you have to offer. So we want to make sure all of those reasons to not change, we hear them, we respect them, we make space for them, but we don't live there. And one of the things we've actually learned from the research on this over time is that the weight of sustained talk is greater. We're biased against change. What we do to manage sustained talk has a bigger impact on whether or not we're successful than what we do to manage change talk, which is the exact opposite of what we thought in this work for a long time. Here's to continuous learning, friends. Now, I told you we wanted to ask fewer questions. I did not tell you to not ask questions. Questions are good. You can still keep your favorite questions. We want to use them more intentionally if we're going to use them in an MI consistent way. Now, we often talk about questions as being open or closed. As with so many binaries, I find the binary here to be unhelpful because it's very easy. A lot of questions exist in between those two poles, and it's very easy to hear, oh, but that's closed, and here's why, and think, wow, I asked a bad question. Not necessarily. A lot of things live between open and closed. And I think it helps to make room for that. We're going to go through a few examples in just a sec. But when we're coding this for the purposes of understanding someone's use of MI, a couple things to keep in mind. Demands are considered questions. So one of the first things a lot of people learn is, oh, I can't ask you, what'd you do yesterday? But I can say, tell me what you did yesterday. That's a statement, right? Okay. Yes, it's a statement. It's a demand. We're coding it as a question because you're asking, so you're compelling someone to respond immediately. The other thing that we realize is that tone matters, right? If you tell someone who's in a place where they're not sure what their next step is, you're not sure if you can help. They may receive that as an expression of empathy. That may support them in the conversation. We tick our tone up just a little bit at the end. You weren't sure you could help? They're probably going to feel differently. That's not going to land the same way. And that is something a lot of us do, myself included, when we're nervous. We skew up at the end of a comment. We turn to something that sounds like a question, and that can actually have a big impact. So when we think about open and closed questions, put a few examples up. You're going to tell them no, right? What do we think in the chat? Open or closed? And yes, I just acknowledge this as a spectrum. So which would you feel is more prevalent, open or closed? Right? This is the most closed example I'm going to give you. It's so closed, the answer is right in there, right? I do this more often than I'd like to admit and have had to train myself out of it. You understand, right? That's a terribly closed question. I just told you what I hope your answer is. This is perhaps the most closed example we can have here. What do you think you should say to them? This is a little more open. How is this still closed? You can speak up, you can chat in, whatever you're comfortable with. What's closed about this? You're saying they need to say something. Yeah. You're going to say something, right? Hmm. Well, I wasn't sure, but let's dial it back one more notch. How are you going to respond to that? And now we've taken them off the hook for saying something, but we've told them there's an expectation they're supposed to do something. It's on them. Is this more open than the last two? Probably. Is this 100% open? No. What are you going to do? This is a textbook MI example, and it's pretty darn open, but there's still an expectation here. You're going to do something, right? Again, this doesn't make it a bad question. I think the best we could get to being totally open is, how are you feeling right now? In general, in these conversations, more open questions are better. But that does not mean that closed questions don't have a role. If you've been talking with someone for 20 minutes and you're working through what their next steps are going to be, a closed question around, let's say, do you really think you can do that by next week? Could be extremely helpful and appropriate. There are situations in which any of these can be helpful. But I think it's really useful to acknowledge it's not just open or closed. There is a spectrum, and there are many points along that spectrum in which we can engage folks. So, what's so bad about questions then? Why am I telling you to use fewer of them? Well, many of them are often narrowing, right? A lot of those examples that we just covered, they are closed in some way, shape, or form. They focus in a way that we don't have any business assuming that the person on the other end of that conversation is going to focus. They can communicate status and power. If you're the one asking questions, often people will assume that you have power in a situation, or that you think you have power in a situation. Maybe worse. They're one way. We have feelings as a culture around what it means to answer a question with a question, and they're not that positive most of the time. If I'm asking a question, you're supposed to be offering a statement. And they set an expectation for an immediate response. If I'm asking you a question, the implicit assumption is you're going to answer it now. Maybe you're not there. I'm a slow processor. I benefit from having time with questions. That can be tough. So questions aren't bad. Open questions aren't always the best answer. Using fewer questions and more open questions can get us a long way toward having more productive learning conversations. I'm just checking on the chat. I missed the first part of this, but it reminds me of how it's seen as better to communicate to autistic children with declarative language or observations instead of questions, which are demands. What an interesting example to cite, right? And yeah, I could go into a little depth on that. But yes, I think that's a very fair comparison. I think one of the things, and I'm not a mental health specialist, so I don't want to go too far down this road with anyone who's on the spectrum, is that it's often difficult for them to understand why you would make decisions that are different from what they would make. And so we want to be respectful of the fact that they may not be able to make that leap immediately or at all, and be able to speak to that. Like I said, I am not a professional in that area. I hope I did that justice. So if you're not asking questions, and we're going to start to make this more engaging at this point in the session, what in the world are you supposed to do? The first time I got put in a situation where this really hit me was I was in an 8-minute recorded interview with a trained actor who was acting as a patient, and they told me, you get 3 questions in 8 minutes. And I thought, I'm done. I can't do this. 3 questions in 8 minutes? I was taught to ask good questions, and I ask great questions. We all do, right? But I asked the best ones. No, I didn't. What are we supposed to do instead? And what we focus on, for the most part, is reflection in MI, right? I couldn't find a great definition of what qualifies as a reflection in motivational interviewing, so I made this up. Using statements to emphasize or build on what someone has shared in a way that stabilizes the conversation or moves it forward. We start with statements. We focus on what someone has already offered, but this also acknowledges there's a couple different ways to go with this. We can emphasize certain parts of what they've said, especially important if someone's a talker, and maybe you want to focus on some of what they've said, or we can build. We can stabilize a conversation, which might be helpful if it's challenging, or we can move it forward if we feel confident. Reflections can help us with both. So a few quick examples. A reflection might be, you've been working through this issue for a while. That's something you could offer back in the form of a statement. A question might be, are you going to try something different? Sorry for the typo there. Both, which would count as a question if we're going to code it. You didn't like the way you felt when this happened. What are you going to do about that? If a question is part of an utterance, part of a statement before somebody else responds, we code that as a question when we're thinking about MI consistency. And then there are the ambiguous ones where tone matters. You don't know if you can pay your bills this month. You didn't feel like you could help. We skew up at the end of those, that changes. And that's one of the challenges with coding these, is that intention does matter. Just some quick examples of the difference between a reflection and a question. In MI, we start with the distinction between simple and complex reflections. Simple reflections involve repeating or rephrasing what you've heard. Complex reflections add something, meaning or emphasis. Both can help move a conversation forward. Both can be useful. So much the same way that more open questions are preferable across the scale of a conversation than more closed questions, complex reflections are preferable to simple reflections. But that's not to say that simple reflections are bad. If somebody's a talker, they've given you 10 different things they want to talk about, and you'd like to talk about one of them, a simple reflection can be a really effective way to help you focus. I hear that these 10 things are important to you, and this was one of them. I find this distinction helpful. I also find it insufficient because there's a lot that lives under complex. So this is where we're going to land in practice for today. Some different depths of reflection, right? We'll start with simple. What someone said, you can repeat it back. People who hate MI usually stop here. They feel like they're a robot that's supposed to repeat whatever has been said. And truth be told, if you stop here, I would hate this too. So I can empathize with those folks. There's meaning, what someone implied or intended to say, maybe didn't. There's continuing, someone cut off, what were they likely to say next? If you kept the sentence or the paragraph going, what might have been there? We can acknowledge someone's emotions or what they're feeling, what drove that statement. We can call out their values, something that's important to their identity that they communicated to us. Or we can call out ambivalence. And there's an art to doing this well, because the wrong way to do this is, you don't like the pharmaceutical industry and you're stockpiling ivermectin. Make sense of that for me. Whether or not you like that statement, it's never been helpful in moving anyone toward a change in their behavior. So there are ways to do that well, and we'll talk about that in the context of an example. Reflections of meaning or continuation, these are helpful more often, I'd say, when a conversation is aligned and you feel like you want to keep pushing forward. Acknowledging emotions and values can be particularly helpful when it's challenging and you want to try and center or stabilize a conversation. So Let's try a quick example, one I may or may not have heard before in my professional life. This session's BS. Pretend I got this feedback. What might some reflections look like? You don't like this session so far. That'd be pretty simple. There might be a role for that, depending on how heated a conversation was. We can get to meaning. You aren't getting enough out of this. They didn't say that explicitly. It's a reasonable leap. We can continue what they might have said. You're reconsidering whether or not you should stick with this session. Maybe they feel that way or don't. If they don't, they're probably going to correct you. It's okay. Talk about emotions. You're frustrated by what you've heard here. It'd be really helpful in a heated conversation. Talk about values. It's really important to you that we use your time well. Or we can get to ambivalence. You expected something from this session, and you don't feel like you've received it. Two things to call out here with what we call a double-sided reflection in MI, how we acknowledge ambivalence. One is we always use a positive conjunction. Stay away from buts and yets. Those offer value judgments for part of what you've said, right? If I said, you're expecting from this session, but you haven't gotten it, that's going to land differently. And we want to put whatever we want to focus on second. An interviewee is much more likely to focus on what they hear last. So if we want to talk about how they feel about what they've received, we should use that second in the statement. Just a quick example of what it looks like to get to these different depths. Everything else I have today is practice, but before we get to that, any questions or observations about these? Yeah, go ahead. I see a hand raised.
I feel very much like this information, you said it right off the top. You're speaking to an open minded, receptive group of people. The fact that we're here probably presents some bias. What do you do in a situation where this is sort of your philosophy, but your boss, your manager, the culture might not be as receptive? It's sort of a, I'm the CEO, executive director. This is what I feel. I really don't give a crap what you're saying. So do what I ask. Like that's always been sort of a challenge when the values are misaligned between leadership and management.
That is a great question. When we're using this with patients or clients, when we're using this for customer engagement, this is a lot cleaner. You're calling out a situation in which this is a lot harder. So I think it's important to acknowledge that right off the bat. That is a great example of a place where MI isn't going to be helpful with the entirety of that conversation. I do think there's a role for it. I do think there's a way to use this to center on what is the change that this executive is willing to make. In the same way that we might treat a patient or a client with the respect of what is the change they're willing to make. You can approach somebody who's in a professionally sort of superior position with that mindset and learn, what are they willing to do? What aren't they willing to do? But then, of course, you have to ask yourself if that's sufficient for you, if that's enough. And that's one of those cases where we step outside the bounds of where MI can be helpful. So can this as a skill set help you clarify what are they willing to change? And is that enough for me? I believe it can. Can it make it okay if it's not enough for you? I wish it could, but no, it can't. It can get you to a place where perhaps you framed a difficult decision more clearly than you were able to before. I'm very conscious that's only going to be so helpful, but is at least a little helpful. Any other questions, or we want to try an example or two or three? So I shared a list of 8 of these with a dear friend who is part of Grow Class, who I know knows this community very well. And I said, if any of these stink or you really love them, can you tell me? And they said, no, they're all great. I've heard all of these. So we're not going to cover all of these. We don't have that kind of time, but they're here. And what I wanted to offer is, since all of these might be helpful, where would you like to start? We've got 8 different examples here. So I'd ask you to take a minute to read these and maybe just drop a number in the chat. I can't promise you I'll get to everything, but if there's energy around some and not others, we'll go there. I see 2 4s, so we're going to start there. And my hyperlinks work. How about that? Please do not take this as an invitation to stop putting recommendations in the chat. I would love to keep getting them, and we will get to as many as we can. But in the name of time, we're going to roll with what we got if there's some consensus. So I get how this would help more established companies. Maybe we're not just there yet. What kind of reflection might you start with? Based on what you've heard, where would you go on that list on the right? Meaning, continuation, emotions, values, ambivalence. Unsure? I'd be asking how they are defining established. Okay. How might we rephrase that as a reflection? Right? We could think about, you feel like you've moved past a place where this can be helpful to your company. You feel like this is helpful for teams at certain stages, but not others. I also saw a comment in the chat around ambivalence. Right? This is a great example of where we could use ambivalence to frame back. Anyone want to take a crack at what that looks like? Go ahead. I see a hand raised.
Hi.
Hello.
So ambivalence might be, it sounds like you're interested in the impact and the payoff that this thing could have, but you might be worried that it's not worth the investment. You might not be ready for the cost.
First bit of feedback I would offer is take the but out and replace it with an and. I know it sounds small. I wish it were small. It's not. But that's really good, right? You value the impact and you're worried about the cost. That's the short version of what I feel like I just heard. Is that fair?
Yes.
Hey, I would bet you get something back to that. I'm not going to bet heavy on what it's going to be because that goes against the whole spirit of the enterprise. I would say you might stand to learn something. What do others think? Right? My example for ambivalence around this was, this meets a need for your team and it requires more than you feel like you can give right now. There are a lot of different ways to do this. Actually, Meredith, I think I like yours better, to be perfectly honest. Emotions, fear. Okay, so I hear emotions being called out in this. How might we reflect that fear?
A fear of not being established enough, not to be at the proper point.
What could you say to them?
A response to this question?
Yeah, what might you say to call out that fear gently?
Well,
Ooh.
let's try and see.
Yeah, I see a good example in the chat. Being the person to introduce a new idea is daunting. It's hard to put yourself out there. We're thinking about fear and uncertainty. You're uncertain about how this fits in for a team at your stage of growth. See another one in the chat. You're afraid of wasting money and not meeting targets. Some of what this does is it gets people talking. And if you've ever done professional customer interviewing, you know when people start telling stories, it's gold. They start sharing things they didn't know they were supposed to share, and some of them are really valuable. So when we call out issues like being afraid of wasting money or not meeting targets or the social pressure of introducing new ideas in a group, what we're really doing is testing, is this your issue? Because the sooner you learn about that, the sooner you can focus, oh, this is about money? Well, that's a lot different than if it's about social pressure. I don't know if questions are going to get you there nearly as quickly as a considered reflection. To build on that, I see you're afraid of distracting from targets. Okay, there's an assumption in that this is outside of the scope of existing targets. That's a really good one to test. These are really good ones. I think there was a lot of energy for 5, so I'm going to go there next, and we will see how much time we have to get to others. This just isn't going to work for our team. Our company's different. We're just different. Where might you start? What category might you go to? See a couple around meaning. Okay, what made you want to choose meaning here? I see good questions here. And then I see MWs. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Different is vague, right? We need something to dig into. They're not giving you a whole lot here. I think asking something around meaning is really a really helpful next step, right? It could be as simple as, you don't think this is a fit for you. You don't think this solves a problem that's important for your team. The customers that we've helped are different than your organization. You don't see yourself as competing with them. A little sharper, but if someone's really being vague with you, that can be a helpful way to nudge them. Okay, you don't see yourself as competing with these companies. I understand. Anyone go in a different direction here? There are emotions we could tuck into here, fear and uncertainty. Right? I might think about, oh, I see one in the chat. So you want to solve problems and you hate process. Okay. It's important to you to solve problems, but this isn't your game. Can something be altered to provide a better fit for your company? So we could rephrase that as a reflection. Something more tailored might meet your needs. Right? If we want to get to values here, and I like calling that out, maintaining your company's identity is a priority for you. You have a strong sense of identity. You don't want to look just like everybody else. You don't want to be perceived that way. Maybe time for one more example, or do folks have questions that it would be helpful to talk about? What did we have nominated? See, an 8 and a 2. Let's go with 8. Do one more. Different also implies better or special. We could test that. You feel like you're doing a better job of meeting these needs for customers in those organizations. I don't quite want to call someone out for thinking they're special. I mean, I do, but I don't. Inside conversation. Let's think about this example, though. We might just end up doing this internally. Has anyone ever heard this? Lots. Where would you start? Continuation, right? This is a nice short sentence. C2, it sounds like you're ready to tackle this problem. Excellent reflection. Okay, it sounds like you're ready. You've got, somebody was phrasing earlier, you've got this, cowboy. Okay. Right? Something around continuation. So if I really wanted to test it, okay, you've ruled out external support for this. If I'm curious if they have. You've made a decision. You're not doing that. Do I need to waste my time on these conversations going forward? Be real helpful to know if I didn't. Be real helpful to know if that's not the case and it's something else. I like focusing on capability in Jeff's comment. It sounds like you're ready to tackle this. I also see the comment around emotions. Fear of committing to this externally. It's a big step to make this commitment. Right? Fear could be driving this. Is there a positive emotion that might be under this? You recognize how you're confident in your team. And you could leave it at that. Short reflections could be really powerful here. You're confident in your team. And then pause. Don't worry if it's an awkward pause. You want to see what they say to that. You also want to see how long it takes them to respond to it, because my, is that an indication of confidence? If there's 20 seconds of silence, maybe not so much. Maybe you learn as much from that silence as you do from their answer. You don't feel like this is needed. You don't feel like this is necessary. You recognize how capable your team is in this area. You feel like you've got this. Let's talk about their capability. They can do my job. Don't say that, but think it. You got a room full of people who can do my job. I should be learning from you. I know that we're getting toward the end of the hour, but a few ideas for how to respond to things like this with utterances other than questions. When you get good at this stuff, you're usually trained to have at least 3 reflections for every question that you ask in any given conversation. That's not a hard and fast rule. That's not to say if you're at 2.5 to 1, you failed. I do not believe in that at all. And it often depends on what you get back from someone. But I think it's a helpful place to start. I think it's a helpful skill set for people with you all's professional backgrounds to consider how you would use. And in all honesty, it's not a skill set that's traditionally been taught to marketers. And I'm not really sure why. any other questions that folks have, or feedback or reactions while we have a couple of minutes left? Anyone want to go meta and reflect to me? Go ahead, Meredith.
Oh, I'm totally going meta and reflecting to you. Just wanted to share a reflection. I'm a marketer and a therapist, or future therapist, and I'll just observe that everything you just unpacked for us is the interactional unit of parenting through conflict. For example, if you've ever had a toddler or a teenager or anyone in between, and you know what you're doing when you're sitting in the therapist chair has different outputs and different outcomes, but this is very much the same situation. So my brain is exploding all over the place. I love this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for offering that. I spend a lot of time with therapists now, learning and practicing this, which I didn't necessarily anticipate as a non-therapist. My own therapist finds it deeply amusing. So I really appreciate that you brought that perspective. You also offered the comment around parenting, and I will say there's been some things put out there. This is one of them. If we can get it on there, the School of Hard Talks, written by somebody else from Boston, who I had the chance to meet recently, who is a really lovely person, Emily Klein. So if you're looking for a place to start with how to use motivational interviewing in conversations with kids, and she's focusing on teenagers, but as the parent of a 10-year-old, most of this generalizes perfectly fine. Thank you very much. That's a great place to start.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was such an insightful session. Like my brain was also breaking Meredith's, trying to like actually learn on the fly with the practice. That was so helpful and beneficial. And like, how would I frame this for meaning or like ambivalence and things like that? That was so great. So thank you, Jeff. I will be dropping all of Jeff's links in the chat for everyone. So if you want to connect with him, you can connect with him there. He is also in our Slack community, so you can hit him up there as well. But he is going on vacation as of Thursday, so he may take a minute or two to respond. Have a great vacation, Jeff. Don't respond to anyone while you're on vacation. Thank you, everyone, for all your great questions and participating and showing up today. We will be sharing the recording in Slack and an email. Shout out to Jenna. Thank you for your help with that. Otherwise, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, friends.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate you.
Take it easy. Thank you, Jeff. That was so great.